Good morning and welcome back to our Ask the Agronomist video series. I'm Kyla Watson here with Phil Long on a beautiful morning. Phil, how's it going?
Oh, it's going just fantastic. Like you said, another beautiful morning, a little bit wetter than it has been all season around me at least, but that's a good thing, a welcome rain, and it came at the perfect conditions, nice and slow. So.
Right, exactly. Well, today we're going to be talking about the top 3 ear rots and the top 3 stalk rots that we're seeing out there in the fields.
Yeah, this is a perfect time to talk about stalk and ear rots. I know I've been out in a lot of fields and we're getting a lot of reports from all over Latham country on a lot of cornfields that aren't looking great in terms of lower stalk quality and lower stalk health. Just as it's kind of a sign of the times. 2020 has been a tough year, and whether you had all the nutrients down or not, there's a lot of stressful conditions, especially after pollination, that didn't really allow the plant to utilize all those. And so maybe especially the higher more racehorse hybrids might be trying to finish out and steal from some of the stalk, as well as just, like I said, hail events and a lot of different weather events that have made it a challenge for the plant to stay healthy. So
right, it's been an unpredictable year nonetheless, like usual.
Yeah, exactly.
All right, well, we're going to start first on the stalk rots. I know you have a couple examples with you. What would you say would be the first most common stalk rot you could see out in the field?
Yeah, sure. So one of the most common, we talk about anthracnose all the time. Anthracnose, especially early in the season, but this is later in the season. Anthracnose infecting from, most of these are going to infect from the roots. They can also be, they're in the residue from previous years, so they can be splashed up on the plant, but many times they come in through the roots, even scars or insect feeding as well. All those things can help those things get into the lower part of the stalk, infect. Anthracnose is probably one of the more common ones that we see. Typically one that's a little more easily identifiable from the outside, although stalk rots can be a challenge to identify. Splitting the stalk is typically the best way to do it, but anthracnose usually has kind of black blotchy spots around the nodes and then moves down the stem as it develops. And then once you split the stem open, you'll notice browning, basically a disintegrated pith or center part of that stalk. Kind of looks kind of shredded like a lot of them do, but tends to have brown from the nodes as it moves up and down the plant. So that's one of the more common ones that we see. Another one that I'd say is pretty common is also fusarium. And a lot of these, like we're going to talk about ear molds, kind of have the same names, you'll notice, but fusarium is one that's also more common, a little harder to identify from the outside of the stalk. Doesn't always show great symptoms on the outside, but once you get to the inside, you'll just notice a disintegrated pith once again. It may remain white or have a tannish, maybe even a brownish color, but it'll be disintegrated and kind of shredded as well on those lower nodes. So those two are probably more of the two common ones we'll see. Another one I'd throw in there, especially given the conditions that we've had, is gibberella. Gibberella is one that seems like is a little easier to identify, whether it's on the ear or in the stalk. That's the one that we always talk about, has the pinkish color to it. So it can have brown streaks on the outside of the stalk, starting from the nodes going down in between the inner nodes. But once you get to the inside of the stalk, you're going to typically notice a whitish mold and a pinkish mold will start to grow and move up and down from the inner or the nodes. Excuse me. So that one's a little more easily identifiable. But any of these are common, especially in the situation that we've had this year with the drier conditions after pollination. But there's a lot of stalk rots out there, so that's why it's always a challenge to identify them.
Okay, thanks, Phil. And before we move on to ear rots, would you mind talking about hybrid tolerance against stalk rots?
Sure. Yeah. So that's hybrid tolerance is really important. We talk about that when we talk about fungicide applications and whether you should make that decision, whether it will pay. Because obviously the background of the genes and the genetics in that plant play a big role into how it will tolerate diseases. And the same goes with stalk rot. So if you look in our product guide, you'll notice that we have anthracnose stalk rot ratings, and that gives you an indication of how well it does with anthracnose. But you can also look at the fungicide ratings to get an idea, okay, does this particular hybrid tolerate and do better with certain diseases? And typically if it does better with all of them, it has a stronger agronomic background, I call it. Something like our 5742 or 5495, some of those that have just a really strong agronomic background that don't need fungicide. They stand up really well. You may even see some issues with on the outside of the stalk. You may see some browning or discoloration and not see that nice green color that we like to see in the lower stalk, but they may still hold a pretty strong rind and stand well into the late season, but not something you want to take a chance with. You know, the biggest thing as you're walking through fields right now is making sure you're testing those things. So go out, do the push test, you know, push them over at a 30 to 40 degree angle as you're walking through the field, and make sure you pinch that lower stalk and see if there's like this one in this case is obviously disintegrated. It's easy to pinch. You can tell that it's got issues. They both had nice size ears on them, so that's something you got to take into account. If it has a big ear on it and it's obviously weak in the lower stalk, weak at the knees, we call it, it will easily be pushed over if we get strong winds. So all those things got to come into play, and just make sure you're watching out for that as you do your pre-harvest scouting and kind of determine which fields need to go first.
All right, and now let's jump over to the ear rots. What would you say are the top 3 ear rots?
Sure. So once again, going back to the year that we've had, so looking at some of the ones that are more for hot and dry conditions. So I've got an ear here. Doesn't show a lot of ear mold, but this one was a little bit exposed at the top, had a little bit of damage from insects, potentially even birds. It's probably showing some signs of the penicillium ear mold on this one. It's tough to see, but the 3 that I picked out is going to be Fusarium, Penicillium, and Aspergillus, and those 3 are because it's been hot and dry. So typically you'll notice in all those, like when I pulled the husk leaves back on this one, there'll be a little plume of dust or those spores coming out. You'll notice that's typical of all 3 of these. So Fusarium is going to be the one that's going to be more identifiable, I call it, because it's a little easier to pick out the pattern, I guess. When you pull back the husk leaves on a Fusarium ear mold, you're going to notice that it's just individual kernels throughout the ear. It kind of looks weird. You'll see a white or a pink cottony growth just kind of come up from a particular kernel, and that's characteristic of Fusarium. Compared to Aspergillus is typically like an olive green color, starts at the tip and infects those kernels, can work its way down, but can also follow if you have insect damage on the ear, particularly from western bean cutworm or corn earworm infestations. It can follow those paths. The other one I mentioned was Penicillium, and that's also a blue-green color, and typically starts like this at the top of the ear and between the kernels, but it can also be throughout. So those are the top 3 I picked just because they fit this year. The ones that we've seen, I've seen Fusarium and like I said, Penicillium out here, but there's a lot of different ear molds, just like with stalk rots. So keep that in mind. It's kind of tough to tell them apart. Take a good look at it, take the sample from the field, and if you have questions, either send us some pictures or you can send it off also to a state university as well. So really the importance with this is that all of these can produce mycotoxins. So that's the biggest call out when it comes, especially if you're feeding it, but even for grain storage, any of these. And I know I didn't talk about things like Diplodia or Gibberella ear molds, and those are the more wetter season conditions, the ones that create kind of a mat. It's kind of a gross mold when you open the ear up, but those could potentially be in those areas that have down corn, and any of those situations are going to be really tough to store that mold, because especially the ones that produce mycotoxins, you don't want to store that because they don't get better in the bin. So
okay, very good. All good things to note as farmers are going out and taking some final field notes before harvest.
Exactly. Yep.
Okay. Well, is there anything else that you would like to add this morning?
If I could give a rough recommendation or a general rule of thumb, it would be a 10%, and that applies to both ear molds and stalk rots. So if you're walking through the field and you feel that area that you're in, count some plants and kind of get an idea. Where I was walking, I would say that more than 10% of them did have, and that particular hybrid had some lower stalk issues. But like I said, visit multiple parts of the field. get an idea how much is out there, and that'll give you a better indication how you should prioritize that for harvest, because you don't want to leave it stand in the field if it's not going to stay standing to dry down. This may not be a year to try and get it down to 17% if it's got weak knees.
All right, very good. Well, thank you for that information, Phil. Who knows, next week might come around the corner and a few farmers already might be dabbling into harvest.
Yep, yeah, I think there's a lot of fields right now sitting right on the cusp of that, and with the dry conditions they're talking about, I think we will see a lot of combines in the fields.
Okay, well, thank you for joining us this morning, and thank you to our listeners for tuning in. Have a good day.